Welcome, everyone. My name is Rabbi Sarah Bassin. I serve on the NewGround Board of Directors, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this very important forum on understanding anti-Semitism and its uniqueness in this moment today. Unfortunately, as many of you know, many Jews and Muslims in Los Angeles and across the country have experienced identity-based violence and harassment in troubling ways, in ways that are upticking month by month, and in very terrifying recent encounters in our own backyard. And while there are profound overlaps between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, there are also unique features of each. So as a Muslim and Jewish organization, NewGround, we often explore the intersection of the experiences of these two communities, but sometimes, as in today's program, we're going to find it valuable to take a deep dive into understanding the experience and issues of one. So today's program is designed to explore internal debates, nuances, and the fears of one community. We have an extraordinary panel of experts who are with us, who have been at the forefront of tackling anti-Semitism, and they're going to help us understand not only the current trends, but also some of the fault lines that stand in our way of navigating this rising tide of hate. We are lucky to be joined by leading experts, Eric Ward of Race Forward, Kenneth Stern, the director at the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, and Stephen Smith, the ED Emeritus of the USC Shoah Foundation. Now, obviously, there is a lot of controversy about whether and how anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism connect. We know that there's been a lot of communal discussion around the Los Angeles City Council's adoption of the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism. And we are just one of 32 local communities nationwide that has had this conversation. But we are not here today to pick apart the language or debate its merits. We are here to discuss the underlying concern around the uptick of anti-Semitism and to understand the motivations behind different responses. We are here to understand a community's experience of threat and danger and to determine ways to better face that. So we hope, in the truest NewGround sense, that even in the face of controversy and some aspects of disagreement, that we are still unified by a desire to take on this hateful rhetoric and the violent acts that have been directed against Jews, just as we are when Muslims are targeted. By having this conversation on Zoom, we are going to record this initial conversation among the panelists to have accessible to future alumni and other leader gatherings. This program is going to last in its panel form for about an hour. And then afterwards, you will have the opportunity, if you so choose, to join a non-recorded breakout session for more active discussion. The chat is disabled, but you will have the opportunity to funnel questions into the Q&A that will be fed to me. We will get to as many as we possibly can. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce more in depth our panelists. First, Eric Ward. Eric, it is wonderful to see you again. He is a longtime civil rights strategist, the executive vice president of Race Forward. He was also a Ford Foundation program officer and had a distinguished career as a philanthropist, working for the past 20 years with local, state, and national philanthropic institutions. That doesn't even begin to cover what he does and has done and his presence in this space, but we're going to make these bios brief and allow folks to more in depth introduce themselves and what's relevant to them once we get started. Ken Stern, welcome. We are delighted that you are here as well. Ken is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. He is an award-winning author and attorney and a national expert on anti-Semitism and extremism. He was the lead drafter of the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. He was also an integral part of the defense team in the historic London Holocaust denial case of David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt. Ken, thank you so much for joining with us today. And Stephen Smith, the Executive Emeritus of the USC Shoah Foundation. Stephen is a co-founder and CEO of Storyfile Inc., where he is involved in developing authentic, interactive storytelling supported by the power of artificial intelligence. Fascinating intersection. Thank you for using that for the power of good. Storyfile created conversational video based on the telling of authentic stories and engaging directly with them, deepening engagement for families, products, businesses, and learners. Wow, this is a panel that really has been at the forefront in the fight against anti-Semitism and its recent uptick. So what I would love, actually beginning with you, Stephen, if you would share a little bit on your background and your personal connection to this space of encountering hate and anti-Semitism. And in particular, if you could give people one takeaway, what do you really wish they understood about the most effective ways to address it?
Yeah, well, thank you, Rabbi Sarah. It's great to be here and to be also with you, Eric and Kenneth. So, you know, I'm going to go back 30 years, actually a little bit more than that, to a coal mining village in North Nottinghamshire, England, around about the time that Margaret Thatcher was calling an end to that industry. My father was a Methodist minister, and I was growing up as an evangelical Christian. I never encountered anti-Semitism because I never encountered Jews. In fact, the first time that I did was on a trip to Israel as a 13-year-old, which was a very important moment in my life. Thereafter, I began taking an interest in the Jewish-Christian relationship from a Christian perspective. And of course, the more I delved into that, the more I discovered the long history of anti-Semitism in the Christian world. It was something that has then driven much of what happened in the rest of my life. I went on with my brother James to create the National Holocaust Centre in the UK, which is a thriving institution today. And in the process, wrote a PhD actually about Holocaust survivor testimony. And in particular, not what did Holocaust survivors say, but what did they mean by what they said and have said and do say. That led me eventually to found first of all, a genocide prevention organization called the Aegis Trust, which is an international genocide prevention organization, but ultimately to run the USC Shoah Foundation, founded by Steven Spielberg. So what are the strands that come together in relationship today? Well, you know, the USC Shoah Foundation's 55,000 testimonies are not just a collection of archival stories about the past. They are the warning for our world today, not only in terms of anti-Semitism, but in terms of race and ethnic and religious hatred and discrimination, which we see all around us. They are the voice of their generation and our generation. And at the heart of that, every single one of those 56,000 people are in that archive because someone tried to murder them because they were born Jews. And therefore, it is also an extremely important archive to understand the origins and the causes and consequences of anti-Semitism in our world today. They continue to guide me and my work. And my one takeaway that I would say that I would like to see coming out of our conversation today is not what are others doing about the prevalence of anti-Jewish hatred that we see all around us, but what can I do? And when I say that, I don't mean what actions can I take, but what can I learn? How can I increase my curiosity? How can I feel safer? Not because of greater defenses that we put up, but because of events just like this, where people of different backgrounds come together to learn together to create the safety that we need. And how do we do that with more people?
Thank you so much, Stephen. And really coming at it from the angle of centering personal story is something that connects deeply with NewGround's approach and our kind of human-centered, empathy-centric approach to this work. Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to share also a little bit about your background and the really important takeaway that you want people to have on what it means to take on anti-Semitism.
Yes. Hello, everyone. So again, my name is Eric Ward, Executive Vice President of Race Board. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Look, I think that the question around anti-Semitism can be summed up in this way. At the end of the day, being one of the few individuals in this country who called both the election of Donald Trump, the rise of the alt-right white nationalist movement, 6 years of political violence and the targeting of minority communities defended by a presidential administration. And January 6th, I feel very safe in making this pronouncement. Taking and tackling anti-Semitism is important because it is the narrative that is driving a political attack on multiracial democracy in this country, a multiracial democracy that largely has been built through Black struggle in this country. I'm not here to argue that we have a perfect or complete multiracial democracy, but I am clear that it is Black generations who have largely fought and died in this country to bring about some semblance of equity. And over the last 50 years, we have faced a significant backlash to those gains. And it is driven by a narrative that Black people and others are merely the puppets of their Jewish puppet masters. While that may not seem to be a big deal, that narrative at the end of the day denies the legitimate grievances of minority communities in this country. Regardless of whether you think of anti-Semitism as a set of tropes or stereotypes, or anti-Semitism as a conspiratorial thinking, the result is this: without tackling anti-Semitism, our democracy is at risk, and so is over 70 years of Black civil rights struggle that has brought us to a place where multiple communities are positioned to argue for a society where we can all live, love, worship, and work free from fear. I didn't come to this conclusion through academia. I wish I was a better scholar. I didn't come to this as someone who grew up in the civil rights movement. I'm a post-civil rights child who grew up at a time where Black people were not considered legally to be full human beings at the last stages of the civil rights movement in this country. I learned it from experience, growing up in a punk scene that was first targeted by this white nationalist movement in this country. Many of us were beaten and assaulted by a white nationalist movement that was just beginning to flex its muscles. In short, we've seen the impact of this white nationalist movement. Attacks on Black worshipers in Charleston, South Carolina, attacks on Sikh worshipers in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, attacks on Latinos in a Walmart in El Paso, Black worshipers in Buffalo, Muslims, including the recent arrest of an individual who was responsible for the arson of 2 mosques and the attacks on Congressional Representative Ilhan Omar's offices in Minnesota. But one thing is clear: while certainly Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, xenophobia, the hatred of immigrants drove those attacks, in each case, the killer was driven primarily by a world belief that they were in a war with the Jewish community. The truth is that anti-Semitism impacts all of our communities. And if we do not lean into our leadership and learn this narrative so that we can disempower it, 70 years of Black struggle will have been in vain. And as a Black civil rights leader, I won't have it. Even with the difficulty of the conversation around anti-Semitism, the conflation around the discussion of Zionism and anti-Zionism, we have to lean in together. And that means building the necessary relationships to have a discussion around a form of bigotry that too many of us have ignored. That's why I've leaned into this work for 30 years. And it's why I'm excited to have these conversations with you all today.
I appreciate that. And in particular, the fact that you really had been at the forefront of understanding white nationalism, having a front row seat to the growth and the strength building of that movement to just bring your experience and essentially be 5-10 years ahead of the rest of us on understanding the trajectory of where this is going. And especially given that we're a little uncertain on the intersection of race and anti-Semitism and racism and Islamophobia and xenophobia. Like, this is a really difficult conversation. To have you unify and connect all of those in a very clear way is a helpful start for locating this conversation. So thank you. Ken, I'm going to toss it over to you to share some of your background, what you're bringing to the table, and what you really want people to understand of effective ways of combating anti-Jewish hatred.
First of all, thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with Stephen and my old friend Eric. And in terms of my background, I'm a little older, so I do recall growing up in the civil rights struggles and seeing that on the news every night, and informed a lot of how I thought about hate. And going to college, I was always sort of fascinated by why people divide up and see an us and a them, and where that leads to, and how do we understand it, and what do we do about it? And that's been something that I've wrestled with when I went to law school in Oregon. And Eric knows these stories. There's the Posse Comitatus, which was a precursor to the 1990s militia, were very active in Portland, and I ran into them and saw their anti-Semitism. I saw the some hatred around other groups as well. I was a lawyer for the American Indian movement and certainly saw a lot of anti-Indian hatred. And in Portland, I also saw not only the anti-Semitism from the right, but sort of startling to me at the time, because I was, among progressive lawyers dealing with things, I saw some anti-Semitism on the left, particularly around the Israel issues. I was going to demonstrations against the '82 war in Lebanon, which I thought was ill-advised. And I started, because I thought it was a proper place for me to be, but I saw people that were part of the cohort that were protesting saying things that were not that dissimilar from what some of the posse people were saying about Jewish conspiracy and so forth. And that really startled me. One of the things that I've been doing over the last number of years, in addition to 25 years at the American Jewish Committee, deciding not to wait for cases to bring issues of hate and anti-Semitism, but to deal with them directly, has been to work with trying to make us all smarter about how we deal with it, because it's a very difficult issue. There's no silver bullet. And one of the things didn't mention about Eric's very impressive and long history in this is his work at two places. One is he was working at the Northwest Coalition, which was set up by a guy named Bill Wasmuth, who was leading the efforts in the Pacific Northwest on how to deal with hatred. And one of the things that he and I wanted to do, and Eric was involved in this too, is saying we need some academic insight. People who are working in agencies that are thinking that they're doing good work on hatred are usually doing it from the seat of their pants, or because it feels strong or it feels right. People get emotional and agitated. And there's a lot of good thinking in the academy, but there isn't really direction in terms of how do we know what works and what doesn't work and why, and how do we pull in what we know from brain science and social psychology and history and political science and these other fields. So the hate studies movement, which Eric was very much a part of in the beginning of it as well, is to give us some great insights into what to do about it. In terms of the question, there's no silver bullet. I think people want simple answers to complicated questions, and there's a variety of things that I think need to be done. One of it is to realize that it's hard work. It involves all of us. And second, as Eric said, I think spot on, that one of the best things to do in terms of fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of hate is to strengthen democracy, because when democracy is at risk, hatred blooms, anti-Semitism included. There are, guides, and on this I'll stop, but Eric also was most recently at Western State Center And both on the Western State Center website and on the Bard Center for the Study of Hate website, we put together with the Montana Human Rights Network a community guide for opposing hate. That's everything from how do you form a group to how do you do coalitional work, how do you work with politicians, how do you work with journalists, how do you deal with a lot of the scenarios where anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and other types of hatred manifest themselves in communities. And I think as we each get smarter about this, and work together and, support each other and, preserve democracy, we'll have a fighting chance.
What an important call to remind us that even as this so deeply impacts many of us personally, that leading with emotion isn't always the most strategic approach, and that we need to take a more examined and thoughtful way in our reactions and responses to be strategic. I thought it was as bad as it was going to get in 2018 with the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. And it's clear that we're now 5-ish years later, and it feels like there is a greater sense of threat. So I would love for you all to just gut check me. Is that an accurate perception? Is my growing sense of fear and threat and tension around anti-Semitism accurate? Like, what are you seeing over these last 5 years? Or is this actually not a narrative that's accurate?
I'm going to go first. Let me reflect on this personally first a moment, if I might, Sarah. So I'm in an unusual situation on this panel because I'm in the middle of changing my identity right now. I made a decision last year to convert to Judaism. So that journey has been an interesting one for me in the middle of this on several fronts. First of all, the data tells us that anti-Semitism is sharply on the rise. That's partly because there's more evidence of it. It's partly because we're monitoring better, we're collecting that data better, and we have organizations like this and the ones that Eric are involved in and others right across the world that are much more attuned to and attentive to a threat that I think has always been there, and probably sentiments that are always being expressed, have been always expressed. However, the political environment has turned the heat up on that considerably. And so what we're seeing is the permission being granted through our political and societal processes that are allowing those who do express anti-Jewish hatred, and I would put it, as Eric just said a few moments ago, as a symptom of society, not necessarily as a symptom of people's increased hatred towards Jews. But let me give you my personal perspective, because it's been an interesting one. I have never felt safer now that I have chosen to convert to Judaism. I have community. I have people that share the journey. So I actually discovered this. I was talking to a colleague of mine, and she said, I didn't understand your decision to convert to Judaism in the middle of all of this. And I said, well, wait a minute. I've never felt safer. I got 13 million new friends. Not only do I have that community around me, but I also want to say something a little about what that perspective has shown me. And that is, I am quite uncertain why we are so afraid. We have democracy on our side. We have civil society on our side. We have free speech and open society on our side. We have millions of people who are able to identify and tackle the problem. I was at an event in Indiana just at a time when there was some threat coming from a nationalist movement there in Indiana. And I said to the 300 people in the room, do you know that group couldn't put a group of 300 people together if it tried? And when they do turn up on a Sunday afternoon in a park, it's 30 of them. And what are you talking about? We are all out here on a Thursday evening because we care about the society in which we live. We have each other. We have the ability to teach in our schools, to use the media, to be able to put up a strong defense. And what we should be doing is dropping the fear and focusing on how we're going to actually take our message to our community. And that's what I'm focusing my attention on. And I'm finding that actually is very empowering and very rewarding. And what I find is that these marginal groups who've got little to contribute to society have absolutely nothing on us. And that's the position I will continue to. And I say that as a scholar of the Holocaust and as a scholar of genocide, knowing fully well that every time you see graffiti on a wall that says, "I love Sally," it's graffiti. And if it says "death to the Jews," it's a genocidal threat. I understand the genocidal threat of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred. And every time we hear it, it is a threat to the life of Jews, because we know in the last century that the anti-Jewish hatred leads ultimately to the death of Jews. And so we must take it seriously. And I also feel that we're well equipped to deal with it if we just put up the right approach, join our forces together, and most importantly, stop fighting one another over this, and actually come together as a coherent voice to be able to inform our society and take the millions that would be on the journey with us if we would but talk to them.
Eric, Ken, do you guys want to weigh in?
Or I can. So, look, I think you need a historical perspective, right? I experienced less anti-Semitism than my parents. My parents had less than my grandparents when there were quotas about professions and what colleges you can go to. My children, granted, I'm in New York and not Topeka, Kansas, but my kids have a bit less than I, right? But when we think about it, there's no single factor, and sometimes people get animated by one data set. There are a bunch of different data sets. Hate crimes, certainly that's an indication, but there have been hate crimes going up and down over the years. I don't get too excited by a short-term blip, especially when the reporting is getting better. Attitudes have been consistent pretty much. This one ADL poll that raises an eyebrow recently, but I think their methodology changed, and I think the attitudes generally are better than they have been. And there are other things that are data points too. Intermarriage. The Jews for the last 20 years have been worried about intermarriage. Jews are being loved to death on one level. Then again, we have things that we need extra security at synagogues. We were all concerned about when Kanye was going DEFCON 3 on Jews. And, I think Chappelle was right that the reaction to it was what? He went from a billionaire to a millionaire. You had Emhoff holding a meeting at the White House. So you did see reactions in the way to anti-Semitic expressions that is exactly what you want to see. I don't like comparative hatreds, but it's important, I think, to just reflect for a moment that our congressman from Long Island, the lying George Santos, among the many lies he told to get himself elected was that he was Jewish. You just think for a moment if he would have said, elect me because I'm Muslim. So that's part of the piece too. But I think the largest thing that concerns me about anti-Semitism is not about what people are saying about Jews. It's the larger frame that gets people pushed into anti-Semitic thinking. It's the idea of anyone among us, whether it's immigrants or Muslims or transgender people or anybody else, picked out by leaders and said, that's of them, they're dangerous, it's noble for us to try to take away their rights, to try to hate them. Once you're in that mindset where you see somebody as a danger to you among us and dividing the world that way, it's inevitably that they're going to be pushed towards conspiratorial thinking. Why is it that we're losing to them? And that when you get into that type of thinking, it's inevitable that you get into the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So, the Jewish community is correct to say that anti-Semitism is a canary in the coal mine about thinking about threats to democracy. But the flip side, which we don't think about enough to me, is just as true and perhaps more important, when we're dividing societies this way, it's inevitable that anti-Semitism is going to be increased. So, the lesson from that is don't just worry when people are saying things about Jews, worry when people are saying anything about anybody else.
Eric, do you share the faith that society has the ability to hold this line, to keep this hatred at the margins?
Maybe. I think we better certainly try. I am hopeful about a few things. I'm hopeful that we have the ability to do so. I'm less hopeful that we have the will. I just look, my critique of civil society is a harsh one, right? We, in our arrogance, decided that this social movement was something we did not need to pay attention to. And the result of that is that our communities are in significant risk. We can point our fingers at the Trump administration. We can point our fingers at the white nationalists. We can point our fingers at a host of entities. But at some point, we have to take a look in the mirror and to admit we are ill prepared as civil society to take on this threat because we have not put in the work. At the end of the day, we should be having much deeper conversations around the impact of anti-Semitism, but we're preventing it from doing that because our own civil societies, and I count myself among them, have not done the work to understand the basic mechanics of anti-Semitism in our society and the social movements that seek to tap into it in order to build political organization. The white nationalist movement, the alt-right, right, aren't out there originating anti-Semitism. They are tapping into it, right, to organize in society. I've been an organizer long enough to know one fact. You don't tap into frustrations that don't exist to organize people. The fact that the white nationalist movement has chosen anti-Semitism as its core narrative should alert us to one simple fact, that anti-Semitism must actually exist in society already. If we want to take this seriously, we have to figure out, just as Stephen said and as Ken said, how to disrupt anti-Semitism in general society. And it can't just be slapping people across their knuckles, right, with a ruler. We have to build a positive a force around the type of society we say we want. Look, at the end of the day, I'll just say a few things. The first is, by clearly any data collected, anti-Semitism is being reported more in American society, and so are other forms of bigotry. We should understand that anti-Semitism does not just target the Jewish community. It builds a narrative that seeks to disempower those of us who are arguing for inclusion in American society and American democracy. The third piece is that we have to read the data with our own eyes. Over 21 million guns purchased in the United States last year. The year before, 19 million weapons purchased by Americans, right? This is a country that is arming itself, and it is not arming itself to go out in the woods to hunt animals. It is not arming itself to go out there and play target practice in the woods. These are individuals who have bought into a conspiratorial thinking that has told them that they are in an existential war with the Jewish community and that it is an armed conflict, and that people of color and racial minorities, right, are the puppets of their Jewish masters and are vulnerable because of that narrative. We have to understand that the narrative, right, limits the ability to move policy, right, that addresses underlying inequality in our society. Right? There is no longer a discussion in this country about the inclusion of immigrants and refugees. It is a conversation, and in fact, let me get a little bit harsher. There is no longer even a conversation about the exploitation of immigrants and refugees in this country. The conversation is now centered on what? The criminalization and removal of immigrants and refugees from this country. That is a direct impact of the replacement theory, right, which is a retelling of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. We have watched a former president embrace someone who participated in a direct insurrection to disrupt the validation of the national elections in this country, right? That individual was flying a QAnon flag. That is a conspiratorial thinking that has led to acts of murders and kidnappings in our country. The narrative of anti-Semitism is selling because it's a narrative that works. And it works because civil society leaders don't understand this narrative and therefore don't know how to disrupt it. Until we disrupt this narrative, I will promise you, culture eats politics for breakfast. And the narrative of anti-Semitism is a cultural phenomenon in America. And until we respond to it, we will not be able to proceed on the road of equity in the society. Where we will proceed is down a road of political violence. Many of us have lived in other countries. Many of us have visited other countries where sectarian and political violence is reality. We should not expect that we are the exception on this planet. And anti-Semitism will pave the road to make that challenge much more real. Can we beat it? Absolutely. But we have to build the will across lines of race, religion, gender, and sexual orientation to do so.
So, Eric, that's a heavy prophetic call to hear from you as one of the few prophets that has been right in recent years. And, you know, as I sit with it, it brings even more concern to me about the ways we've been having this internal conversation around some of the fault lines around the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and how that creates a wedge and a division amongst all of us who are on this call, because we are concerned about the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. So, you know, I don't want this to be a space where we rehash the IHRA definition. That's not the purpose of this call. But I do think it's useful for us to hear your reactions to the way that those public conversations have been happening around this definition of anti-Semitism. That includes an acknowledgement of anti-Zionism, and what you're feeling around the public conversation around the definition. So, Ken, I think it's worthwhile for us to start with you as somebody who's been kind of at the center of this conversation.
Well, sure, and to do it in a couple of minutes is impossible, but I'll do my best. I mean, I think one thing to reflect on this sort of from 30,000 feet is that we know how hate works, right? We know that from hate studies that when people are active haters, they, become tribal, they try to simplify things, they look for certainty, they look for right and wrong. There's a whole bunch of brain science and other fields that when people, see the world that way, that's what they do. It's a human thing. So it's not surprising that those of us who are concerned about opposing hate also are affected by the same things. We want symbols, we want black and white, we want to know exactly what to think, what's on this side of the line, what's on that side of the line. And complexity becomes very difficult when it's involved with identity. And I think that's one of the things around the Israel issue, because, for most Jews, me included, a connection to Israel and Zionism is important to our identity. And for some, when they see anti-Zionism, it becomes, as disturbing for them as if some other part, somebody point to your kippah or something else. There are other Jews for whom anti-Zionism is also part of their Jewish identity, whether they're Satmar Jews, or they're young folks, and if not now, or a Jewish Voice for Peace, for whom Judaism leads them to be ones that either don't, reconcile Zionism or the current state of Israel with how you treat the stranger and what Judaism teaches. It's an internal Jewish thing, which is also part of this. The problem with the battles over the definition, and as you said, I was the lead drafter. It was designed to take a temperature over time and borders, and for data collectors in Europe, especially after the Second Intifada and the uptick of hate crimes there. But it was never meant as this simple sort of like Hogwarts sorting hat to decide who's an anti-Semite and who isn't. It was never meant to be used as a hate speech code on a campus. And what I worry about it, and I think you've heard from from Stephen and from Eric and me too, is that anti-Semitism is complicated. It's a social, cultural, political, ideological force. And what we're doing is we're making it harder over these deep-seated differences that we have inside the community and outside the community about Israel to focus on the things that drive people into these anti-Semitic buckets. We're making it on, do you support this side on Israel or support that side? And, both sides are doing it. I really worry when I see things like, Bibi Netanyahu cozying up to Orban. If you look at the videos of what Orban did in the election a couple of years ago, huge posters of George Soros, just like people talked about Rothschild decades ago. The smiling Jew and the worst of in-your-face political, cultural anti-Semitism. And Bibi was, supportive of Orban because he's a friend of Israel. And we see it on the other side too. So what I worry about is this is not the particulars of the definitions. I worry about it's blinding us to being able to combat anti-Semitism or making it as, are you on this side on Israel or that side on Israel? We can have differences over Israel. We shouldn't let the state decide internal communal issues, which is one of the reasons why I've opposed some of the codification of IRA in a way that was not intended. But we shouldn't let us stop us from organizing against it. We could have differences of opinion about this and still go forward. When I wrote my book about this a couple of years ago, I started with a vignette of people that Eric knows well from the Spokane area, where it was this crazy situation where you had the Aryan nations had been close by. There were still threats to anybody who was marching for civil rights there. There was a bomb put in a Martin Luther King Day parade and posters around town. And the way that the Aryan nations had been defeated was partly by a coalition of progressive groups in town and the Jewish community in the Spokane area. And they weren't speaking to each other for 8 years, despite the fact that somebody across the street could be thinking about planting a bomb or doing something else to the synagogue or anybody else. Why? Because the progressive group had a one-page static thing on its website supporting BDS. To me, that's nuts. I understand the deep divisions, but we have to figure out ways to overcome those to fight the common battle that's implicated for all of us.
I think that's the clearest individual example I've heard of what's really at stake by choosing not to remain in coalition against the larger battles. Sorry, I interrupted. Was it Stephen or Eric who was about to jump in?
I was about to just to share a little bit more context as well, just about the IRHA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I was a founder member of that in '98 and was spent a decade on the UK delegation and a decade on the US delegation. So I've had a fairly close read on what they call IRA. It's a really amazing thing that over 35 countries come together twice a year to talk about Holocaust education, remembrance, and research. Think about it. Those governments cover all sides of the political spectrum, and they come and go. Some of them lean left, some of them lean right, some of them go hard right, some of them over what is now a 25-year period, we've seen every shape and size and color of political background. Currently, Croatia is the chair of IRA. So we've always struggled with, so what does it mean to have these different types of political entities, some of whom themselves might have anti-Semites actually in power at the time when they are chairing the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance? And there was a big debate at one point when Austria had the Freedom Party sitting in power, and they were also on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And the question was, so what do we do about that? And the answer was very clear: we keep working together. We keep working together in an environment which is neutral, which allows us to be able to develop consensus on an extremely important piece of history, that is the Holocaust that happened in many of the nations that are part of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and apply its lessons in our world today. Now, this is the tricky bit. How do you, with all of those variety of political perspectives, keep everybody on consensus? Because, by the way, the plenary only votes on consensus. It's probably the only international body in the world where all of its members vote, and if there is not consensus, it does not move forward. Now, the brilliance of the definition, which I was not familiar with in the same way that Ken was on the drafting, but I was very familiar with the process that we went through, resulted in all of the countries agreeing on that definition. And therein lies the power of it. Now, it may not be that everybody agrees with it, and I don't think everybody on those delegations agreed with everything that was in it, but those countries agreed that something had to be done in order to create at least a starting point for how we talk about it in society. I was involved in the what they call the Campus Climate Committee as part of the faculty at USC for a good number of years. And one of the things that always struck me was we did not have working definitions of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or any other transgender discrimination or any other for that matter. Why? Because no one was prepared to put a stake in the ground and say, this is what it is. And if it seems to align with these values, it is not acceptable on our campus. Now, that's where the politics kicks in, because then we start to disagree on the margins of that as what's central to countering anti-Semitism and not, and Israel, yes or no. I think we've just got to put those things to one side. I think if we take that point of view, which is I am going to argue with you, who also has the same aim to end anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hatred in our world, because I disagree on some small, minor political point, we are never going to focus our resources and our time and attention where it needs to be spent, which is on reducing anti-Semitism, on reducing Islamophobia, and on all of the other forms of discrimination. So one of the questions was at IRA, long before we even got to a definition, is if we put a definition in place, will it result in exactly what's happened, which is people disagreeing about the definition rather than actually agreeing on what to do? And I don't think the outcome from this is bad at all, because what it's done, it's heightened focus around debate on what matters and what doesn't. But I just think if we can always prioritize how we put our energy and resources into solving the problem rather than discussing our differences on politics, we would move a lot faster.
Thank you. Eric.
Yeah. So, again, not an academic, right? Not working at the diplomatic level. But I will say this as a person who has been one of a few grouping of folks who has raised the alarm around anti-Semitism, right? For the most part, over the last 10 years, most communal organizations were arguing in the Jewish community, right, to be honest here, right, that anti-Semitism was something that had kind of gone away in the United States, that largely where it expressed itself was in the conversation around Israel, the Palestinian territories, Zionism, right, anti-Zionism, that it was much more an international phenomenon. I sat on a panel, right, a year before Charleston, or for the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where the head of a major communal organization said that they believed anti-Semitism was a thing of the past in the U.S., right? Within a year, we went from anti-Semitism being a thing to the past to folks wanting to pass a definition on anti-Semitism that neither the Jewish community or the country had really been able to debate. I can't weigh into that, but to say, absolutely, the Jewish community has the right to define what anti-Semitism is, or is it just like any other community has the right to define and debate those things? But I think we need a debate first in this country on the nature of anti-Semitism. Like all forms of bigotry, look, I'm a race equity trainer and have been since the mid-'80s. The one thing I know is that bias evolves and transforms in a society, right? The anti-Black racism of 2023 does not look like the anti-Black racism of 1923, and certainly doesn't look like the anti-Black racism of 1823. We have to understand how biases evolve in a society and to what purpose. And I'm not sure we have landed on that here in the United States. Of course, there is an international conversation around this. What I encourage, I think, like Stephen, debate is very healthy. But at the end of the day, does it help us to address the issues at hand right here in our own communities, right here in our own country? And in that case, I think it has served as a distraction rather than a point of focus and unity community. Quickly, Susan, I want to say something else. Despite that distraction, my argument still is it should not be the litmus test upon whether we respond to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or any other form of bigotry, right? I understand, right, as a person who has walked the streets of Hebron, right, you have to understand, right, as a Black American, right, there is nothing but empathy, right, for the day-to-day lives of people who live under harsh discriminatory conditions. There will always be empathy. But I also recognize here in the United States, where we are under fire, white nationalists, when they walked into the Tree of Life, did not care who was a Zionist or an anti-Zionist. The next mass shooter who walks into a Muslim house of worship to set it on fire or to harm people does not care about Palestinian liberation. And we have to make that part of our equation. It can't be the litmus test around whether we come together to save democracy. That is a disastrous decision here in the United States. And as civil society leaders, we have to be able to hold the contradiction in this moment. We are smart enough and we are talented enough to hold those contradictions, to hold those difficulties. And I encourage folks to do that. We don't have to agree in this moment. What we have to agree on is that democracy is under siege.
I think that there's so much political and communal pressure to lean into those litmus tests. And a big part of NewGround's founding was about pushing back against the need for those litmus tests and the importance of forming more resilient coalitions that are able to work through these, challenging divisions to face the bigger problems. This is one of those problems. So you have an audience here of, at this moment, 90 people, but this will be shared with the larger NewGround network. What do you want to say to a group of people who gets it, who buys in, who understands the importance of coalition and resilient relationships through these disagreements? How, where, what do we dedicate our energy toward if we are going to really fight, in this particular conversation, anti-Semitism? Where do you want us to direct our energy? I'm going to do Ken, Stephen, and then Eric, you'll have the final word.
Well, thank you. Just a couple of points to tag onto what Eric was saying. I don't think Jews can agree on a definition any more than African American community or the American Indian community, can agree on a definition. There's no one for everybody. But I do worry that the push for the simplistic aspect of this to try to get it in legislation, to me, is very akin to some of the pushes to not allow critical race theory to be taught and not allow things about gender to be taught. We're seeing it come up in bills. It's the same thing, to try to say this is what we think needs to protect us, and we want legislation to do that. And if you can understand why it's a problem when you have bills in Florida and other places against teaching certain concepts, and the Jewish community is saying, well, we want this to be the same thing too as the law in Tennessee and some other places. that I think should give us some pause, because to me that's harming democracy. And again, if there's one thing that we should all agree on, is to make democracy stronger, to make free speech stronger and protect it, especially when there are people in our community, who are saying things to try to censor other folks. We should speak out about that, because it may, cause us distress to hear things that are anti-Zionist or whatever. But the idea is to allow people to do that and then to speak back, as opposed to using instruments of state. So I said, get off the kick of trying to use law to put a finger on this. That is, to me, terribly destructive. And then the other thing to do is, again, to find places to work on coalitions together and to find how you can do. I mean, Eric remembers, I'm sure, back in the days with the Northwest Coalition, there was a debate about whether the Northwest Coalition, which again was this group opposing the neo-Nazis and opposing the anti-gay ballot initiatives, should have a plank on abortion, because people were making the argument, well, being against abortion, being against choice is hateful, and we should have that as a plank. How could you have an anti-hate organization without doing that? And Wasmith and others decided that, wait a minute, people can find other places to articulate that. But if there's an abortion clinic that gets blown up by neo-Nazis, we want nuns with us at the picket line and the protest. So, keep your eye on the prize. How do you build the coalitions together? How do you, find out ways to have conversations about things that may be challenging? I mean, one of the things that happened in Spokane, where I mentioned where I started that vignette in the book, is people figured, okay, we have to figure out how do we, get around this? How do we get a vocabulary? How do we figure out how to have disagreements, but keep our eye on the prize? And as long as you can do that and have a wider lens, as opposed to labeling something an anti-Semite or not, I think that's half the battle.
Sarah, I always go back to the history of the Holocaust as a reference point. There were those who were prepared to kill. There were those who agreed with those who were killing. There were those who didn't agree with those who were killing, who said nothing. And there were a very, very small minority that actually did something and either used their voice or used actions. I'm making a film right now called The Righteous Road Trip. It's about the 100 or so living righteous among the nations that live mainly in Central and Eastern Europe today. What a remarkable group of people who, when they were 15, 16, 17 years old, chose to risk their life to take their school friend home, or to help them across into a forest, into hiding, whatever they were doing 80 years ago as teenagers. Those are the people I follow. I think I want to just say thank you, first of all, to NewGround for being NewGround and for existing in the first place, because that's part of the hope. The fact that nearly 100 people have turned up today to be part of this conversation, thank you for being a part of this conversation. That's where it begins. It begins in us being together and talking together from all of our varied backgrounds and agreeing on what we can agree with, which is these hatreds should not exist in our society, and it only de-escalates and goes away when we enable that through actually crossing those bridges and taking risks. I would say also, if we're not feeling uncomfortable with the conversations we have, they're probably not the right conversations. Get used to being uncomfortable. We've got to get out of our comfort zones. We have to get out of our echo chambers, and we have to be prepared to do that on an individual level, because organizations can't do it for us. We have to make that commitment. And then finally, I would just say, every single person who was recognized as righteous among the nations, 27,000 of them, important distinction about them. Every single one of them knew somebody who was Jewish and had a friendship or at least some kind of acquaintance with somebody who was Jewish before World War II. Relationships actually matter in terms of what people are prepared to do. Find somebody who's different to you. That's what you're on this call for. Make friendships. Go deep. And if that's your only circle, that's just fine. Because if everybody did that in pre-World War II Europe, there would have been no Holocaust. We have to actually make that effort ourselves. And that we can absolutely all do.
I almost want to leave it on that note. both Ken and Stephen, I think have really underscored, look, relationships and grounding yourself into community and into broad-based community are key to this moment. Look, we don't know what we don't know, but we can choose to know these things. We can choose to understand that we live in a diverse society. And we have to put forward that vision of a real multiracial, inclusive democracy. And it will be challenged. It's already being challenged. And as Stephen said, this is why relationships are so important in this moment. We have a very critical moment right now to build those relationships. Let's build them now for when things get tough, right? After things get tough, those relationships are going to be critical to moving our communities and to moving one another forward. So that relationship building cannot be underscored enough. I'm just going to leave it this way. Look, I grew up as a pretty poor kid on the streets of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and I talk about this a lot. In the summer, as kids, we would play a game on the hot sidewalk called If I Were. And we'd sit in a circle and just say, you know, if I were at the zoo and the lion got out, here's what I would do. And we would argue about what we would or wouldn't do to get out of that situation. The question that always came up is, if I were in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement, here's what I would do. And boy, would we argue. We were full of bravado. We didn't understand the choices of our parents, of our grandparents, right? We were pretty sure about what we would and wouldn't put up with. Susan, that question has always haunted me, right? What would I have done in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement? And that question should haunt everyone on this call. But I realized about 10 years ago, I no longer had to wonder the answer to that question. And neither does anyone on here. The truth is that whatever it is we would have done, however we would have shown up, right, in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, is going to be how we show up and what we do when this call ends. Make it count. History will judge us. The one thing that we can do, that we can choose to do, that no one can prevent us from doing, is to step towards one another, to step into the uncomfort, to step into the unknown. That is the fear of the white nationalist movement, that we will prove that a multiracial society can govern itself, but it can't happen if its leaders refuse to stay in the room together. That's the task before us. It's that simple. Everything else is commentary.
Eric, Stephen, Ken, thank you. If those who are on camera can just offer their gratitude to all of you. This was an important conversation. It's a conversation that, seen some of the questions that I haven't even gotten to, I know that this has surfaced a lot of reflections, feelings, hard emotions. And for those who are wanting and able to stay on, we will divide you into breakout rooms to be able to process through what you're hearing and to share it in a community of people who are here to do that same work. So thank you again to our speakers. And for those who are on in another 30 seconds, you will be divided into breakout rooms for smaller conversation. Thank you all for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.